boy. I was standing in my own workshop, holding a chair leg I'd been sanding for 20 minutes, when a stranger in a suit that cost more than my house walked through my door and said the words that ended everything. The board needs Chief Executive Officer Blake back in the city, immediately. I looked at the quiet woman standing 3 feet away from me, the one who'd been coming into my shop every afternoon for weeks, the one who laughed when sawdust got in her hair, the one I thought I was starting to fall for. Her face went pale, and in that single second, I understood 2 things at once. Everything I thought I knew about her was a lie. And somehow, impossibly, none of it had been a lie at all. I set that chair leg down on the counter and I walked out the back door without saying a single word. I had no idea that the answer to everything was sitting in a leather notebook she'd left behind, and I wasn't ready for what it would say. My name is Ethan. I run a woodworking shop in a small town most people have never heard of, on a street where everybody still waves at everybody. My father built this shop. His father built it before him. 3 generations of sawdust in the floorboards, and until 3 years ago, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life exactly the way I'd always lived it. Quiet, steady, unremarkable. Then I lost my wife, Sarah. 18 months of watching her disappear, piece by piece, while I stood there helpless. When she passed, I didn't leave town. They didn't sell the shop. I kept her sweater hanging by the back door for 3 straight years, because moving it felt like admitting she was really gone. I fixed old Mr. Calloway's wobbly kitchen chair for free, every single time it broke. I never charged a veteran $1 for shelving. The town called me a good man. What they didn't see was a man standing on his porch every night with a glass of sweet tea, carrying a weight he'd stopped trying to lift. Then on Tuesday afternoon, a car nobody recognized rolled down Main Street, dust from some highway still clinging to the fenders. Everybody in town noticed. That's how small towns work. A stranger's car is an event. The woman driving it called herself Victoria Hale, or said she was a writer looking for somewhere quiet to finish a book. She rented the last empty house on Maple Street, paid in cash, kept to herself. 3 days later, she walked into my shop. She wanted a reading chair. Simple, she said, something that would fit in the corner with good light. I walked her through the wood samples, talking about oak and cherry the way I always do. She asked questions that weren't really about furniture, how long I'd run the shop, whether I'd ever thought about leaving. There was nothing about her that felt calculated, no performance, just a woman who listened like she'd forgotten what it felt like to be listened to back. I had no idea who she really was, but I had no idea how bad it was about to get. Over the following 2 weeks, Victoria kept finding reasons to come back: a different wood stain, an adjusted bookshelf, a question about oiling wood she'd already asked me the week before, like she'd forgotten the answer on purpose just to hear my voice explain it again. One afternoon, she asked to learn the finishing work herself for a chapter she was writing. I handed her sandpaper, showed her the motion, and when a poorly clamped board sprang loose and sent sawdust flying between us, she laughed. A real laugh, the kind that doesn't calculate who's watching. I laughed with her, and for a moment, the loneliness I'd been carrying for 3 years just stopped. That should have been my first warning. Nothing that good comes without a cost. A few days later, closing up the shop while rain fell outside, she told me things I don't think she told anyone. That she'd spent her adult life surrounded by people who only wanted something from her. That men had proposed marriage to her within months of meeting her, not because they loved her, but because of what merging fortunes with her would buy them. Her voice cracked. She cried in front of me, and I didn't ask a single question about who she was or where she came from. I just listened. In return, I told her about Sarah, about the nursery we never built, about the job offer I turned down after Sarah died because leaving town meant leaving every memory I had left of her. Neither of us said what was happening between us, but we both walked away that night carrying something fragile we weren't ready to name. I didn't know it yet, but 200 miles away, a man named Daniel Whitford was already hunting for her. Daniel had proposed to Victoria 8 months earlier, not out of love, But because a merger between their two family companies would build an empire neither of them could build alone. She'd said no, and Daniel wasn't a man who accepted no easily. When he learned Victoria kept disappearing for weeks with no explanation, he hired a private investigator, a methodical man named Russo, who started with credit card statements and gas receipts and slowly traced a trail to a town that had never once appeared on any business itinerary Victoria Blake had ever kept. That's right, Blake, Victoria Blake, Chief Executive Officer of one of the largest technology conglomerates in the country, a woman whose decisions moved markets. And she was standing in my shop, teaching herself how to sand a tabletop, telling me her name was Victoria Hay. I was standing in my own workshop the day the truth finally caught up with both of us. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Russo found her. We photographed her outside my shop from a distance, confirmed the scar above her left eyebrow that matched every corporate photo of Victoria Blake, and sent the location straight to Daniel. 48 hours later, 2 black sedans and a legal team rolled down my street. Daniel walked into my shop in a suit that didn't belong anywhere near sawdust, and announced, loud enough for half the street to hear, that the board needed her back immediately. I stood there frozen, a half-finished chair leg still in my hand. The woman I'd been falling for wasn't a writer. She was a stranger, wearing a name that wasn't hers, and I had no idea which parts of the last few weeks had been real. She turned to me, already reaching for words to explain. I didn't wait to hear them. I set the chair leg down and walked out the back door of my own shop. She called my name once. I didn't stop. That night, I sat alone in my house, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, wondering how much of it had been real and how much had been a distraction for a woman used to being bored. Then the town started connecting the dots I hadn't even noticed. The hospital that had been saved from closing, the school roof that got fixed overnight, the small business loans that vanished with no explanation, all of it traced back to Victoria Blake. And then came the piece that broke me completely. The land under my own shop, land my family had only ever leased, had quietly been bought out from under a developer months before I ever met her. Before she'd ever walked through my door, before she knew my name. She had saved my shop before she ever spoke to me. I sat with that for days, unable to decide if I felt grateful or betrayed. I realized then, no one was coming to explain this to me. I had to decide for myself what it meant. It was reorganizing the back shelf, days later, that I found the leather notebook. She must have left it behind in the chaos. I almost set it aside without opening it. But curiosity, and maybe a need for answers I hadn't let myself ask out loud, won out. There was nothing in those pages about mergers or shareholders or strategic goodwill, just a woman writing, in handwriting that got looser and more honest with every entry, about a man who hummed off-key while he worked and didn't know it, about calluses on her own hands that made her prouder than any business deal she'd ever closed, about someone who made stillness feel like a gift instead of wasted time. Nowhere in that notebook did she mention my usefulness, my potential, my value to her company. There was only a woman falling for a man because being near him made her feel like a person again, instead of a title. Week by week, I sat with what I'd read. Quietly, methodically, I packed a bag. I told Mr. Calloway to watch the shop, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I drove 200 miles to the city, carrying that notebook like proof of a truth I needed her to remember about herself. I arrived the morning of an emergency board meeting called specifically to strip her of control. They had no idea what was coming. Daniel stood at the head of a long glass table laying out his case. Victoria's judgment had become compromised, he said. A merger and a marriage would stabilize things. He suggested she sign over a controlling share of her company as a gesture of good faith. Several board members nodded along, loyalty to Daniel's fortune outweighing a decade of Victoria running that company with integrity. Victoria's voice, when she finally spoke, didn't shake. She told the room plainly she would not sign over her shares, would not entertain a marriage proposed as a corporate strategy, would not let her grandfather's company be swallowed by someone else's ambition, because a handful of board members preferred convenience over loyalty. Daniel opened his mouth to fire back. That's when the door opened. I walked in wearing the same flannel shirt I wear every day in the shop, sawdust still on the cups, boots scuffed at the toe. Every head in that glass conference room turned. Nobody knew who I was or why security hadn't stopped me. I didn't look at Daniel. I didn't look at the board. I looked only at Victoria and told her I'd read the notebook, every page, and that I understood now what I should have understood the day I walked out of my own shop instead of listening. I told her I'd come for her plainly, the same way I'd always spoken to her, and that whatever happened with the company afterward was hers to decide. But I wasn't going to let pride keep me from saying what I should have said weeks ago. And then the room went completely silent. An older board member, a woman named Eleanor who'd served since Victoria's grandfather ran the company, rose slowly from her seat. She said, to no one in particular, that whatever this man had done for Victoria, it had clearly done more good than every merger discussion held in the last 2 years combined. Others murmured agreement. Daniel tried to redirect the room, his voice rising with barely concealed panic, but the momentum had already turned. Eleanor moved to table the merger indefinitely, citing the obvious lack of consensus. It passed overwhelmingly. Daniel gathered his papers and left without another word, an empire built on convenience, collapsing in real time in front of the very people he'd hoped to impress. Victoria crossed the room toward me, her composure finally breaking into something the boardroom had never seen from her. She told me, quiet enough that only I could hear, that she was sorry, that she'd been afraid the truth would change the way I looked at her, the way it had changed the way everyone else looked at her for years. I took the same hand I'd once guided across sandpaper and told her that nothing about who she really was could ever change what I already knew to be true. Victoria never went back to hiding. She split her time between the company her grandfather built and the town that gave her something no amount of money ever had, a sense of belonging. We opened a community workshop together. Anyone in town can walk in and learn a trade. No charge, no catch. I still open the shop at 6 every morning. I still fix Mr. Calloway's chair whenever it wobbles. The sweater that hung by my back door for 3 years finally came down. Not forgotten, just no longer an open wound, and in its place, a second coffee mug in the cabinet. A pair of boots by the door that aren't mine. People ask me sometimes if I regret how it started. A stranger, a false name, a secret that could have destroyed everything before it began. I tell them the truth arrives however it wants to arrive. Sometimes it's a boardroom confession. Sometimes it's a chair leg you never finish sanding, and a notebook somebody forgot to take with them. Some doors close so the right ones can open.